Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namanats. Okay, so for tonight's chanting, we're going to do the Junirai, which you can have in the PDF format on the computer, or it is on page 60 in the Red Hawaiian Service book. And for those that know that I like to chant this one a little bit quicker than we do our normal chants on the Sunday service. So please follow along with the beat. Genshu Tennin Shokugyo Amida Senjo Zokuson Zai Mimyu Anako Muryo Bushi Shuinyu Konjiki Shinjo Nyosen no Shama Tagyo Nyozobu Ryomoku Jonyaku Shorenge Koga Chorai Midason Menzen Enjo Nyomangatsu Iko Yunyo Sen Nichigatsu Shonyo Tenku Kushira Koga Chorai Midason Kannon Chodai Kwan Chuju Shuju Myoso Hoshogon Noboku Gedo Makyoman Koga Chorai Midason Mubi Muku Koshojo Shutoku Kyoketsu Nyokoku Shosari Yakutoku Jizai Koga Chorai Midason Jippo Myomo Bosashu Muryo Shoma Josandan Isho Shujo Ganikiju Koga Chorai Midason Pontai Hoken Chishoke Zengon Shoujo Myodai Za Ohiza Jonyo Sen no Koga Chorai Midason Jippo Shorai Shobushi Kengen Jinzu Shianak Sengo Sogenjo Kugyo Koga Chorai Midason Shou Mujo Mugato Yakunyo Suigatsu Denyoro Ishu Seppo Mumyoji Koga Chorai Midason Isom Busetsu Muakumyo Yakumu Nyonin Akudofu Shunin Shishin Kyohison Koga Chorai Midason Isom Muryo Hobenkyo Mu Shoshu Akuchishiki Ojo Futai Shibodai Koga Shorai Midason Gasetsu Hison Kudokuji Shuzen Muhen Yokai Sui Shogyaku Zendon Shojosha Eseshu Jo Ohipo Namandabo 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 Ganishiku Byodo Seisai Dotsubo Ishin Ojo Anato. Namadats, 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 namadats. So before we go into the Dharma talk, one of the sutras are always so personalized. So this sutra I remember very specifically because I was a member of the Seattle Betsuine for many years before I decided to go into the ministry, and my mentor was Reverend Castro, and this was one of his favorite chants. And one of my Dharma friends who I met at the temple, her last name is Koga. So every time we get to that part of the sutra, I'm instantly back at the Seattle Betsuine where I always would sit in about the fourth row back. And I think of my good dear friend who's been a member of the temple for many years. So what I like to do tonight is I'm going to be giving a pretty straightforward Dharma talk. Last time I discussed that we were going to go into the concept of evil. And it's such a complex subject matter that I wanted to do more research on that so we could do it justice. And evil, just so for those that might not be familiar with it, is we've spoken many times in the Dharma Breeze and when I spoke at Ekoji that we have all of these assumptions when we have these words that are in English. And so I won't give away the Dharma talk, but to say it simply, that the word evil in the context of Buddhism and specifically in the context of Jodo Shinshu, our tradition, has a very different connotation than what we would think of maybe in the Geo-Christian context. So I'll whet your appetite for that. We'll be talking about that next week, but I do want to do some more research on that. So what I'd like to do is that talking about Seattle is that there's some things that you always go back to. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to start a reading from the Dhammapada tonight. The Dhammapada is one of the holy texts that has been studied by lay people in Buddhism for centuries. And to show you how my copy is very beat up, this is from, I bought it at the Seattle bookstore over 30 years ago. And I'm looking at the cover tonight and Shakyamuni's kind of losing his face, but we know who it is. So this is a very simple teaching, but again, sometimes the simplicity is the most profound. So when I read this, and then I'm going to talk about an experience about what I realized from these teachings. So if you could please join me in Gasho. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with an impure mind, and trouble will follow you, as the wheel follows the ox that draws the cart. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with a pure mind, and happiness will follow you, as your shadow, unshakable. Look how he abused me, how he beat me, how he threw me down and robbed me. Live in such thoughts, and you live in hate. Look how he abused me, how he beat me, how he threw me down and robbed me. Abandon such thoughts and live in love. In this world, hate never yet dispels hate. Only love dispels hate. This is the law, ancient and inexhaustible. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. It has been a very busy week for us here in the Eastern District. We are very fortunate to have our bishop come from California and spend over 2 weeks in the East Coast area. He first started at Ekoji, and the main reason that he came to the Eastern District, besides coming to the temples, is people might not be aware, but the Buddhist Churches of America, our national organization, is the sole entity that controls who are the Buddhist chaplains in the U.S. military. And so even if someone is from a different Tibetan tradition, like for example, Tibetan or Zen or any form of Buddhism, they go through our office of the bishop. And so he has to come to Washington, D.C. every year to go through a meeting. And so I have to admit, coming from California, where I was so used to seeing a lot of my fellow Dharma travelers, and coming to New York, I was really looking forward to seeing the bishop. And so Eric Ishii gave me a call and said, oh no, the bishop came down with COVID. And so poor Bishop Marvin, fortunately he got to do his services at Ekoji, but then until yesterday, he was in a hotel room from last Wednesday to yesterday. And so instead of going to Seabrook, which he was going to do, which is our temple in New Jersey, and then come up here to the New York Temple or New York Buddhist Church, and then he was going to go to the Albany Sangha, which is in Albany, which is a good 2-hour drive from New York. We have a small Sangha there, and he was going to do the affirmation or naming ceremony for 7 people. So all the logistics of poor Bishop being sick, he did everything virtually. And like I said, I was really selfishly looking forward to spending time with him to get the chance to talk about how the East Coast is doing and asking for his guidance. As you know, I supervise not only Ekoji, but here at New York and also Seabrook. And for those that aren't familiar with the different temples, Seabrook is in the countryside, and it has a very more traditional feel to it. And I was going to go down and spend the day with the bishop when he gave his seminary. And it reminded me, because when I was the resident minister at Ekoji 10 years ago, I also supervised the Seabrook Temple. And at that time, the youth group, which has reformed at Ekoji, which I'm very happy to see, we had about 5 or 6 kids. And so it was an interesting experience for those that remember that, because Ekoji hadn't had a youth group for many, many years. And what I was happy was that, like it has happened most recently, at that time, 10 years ago, it kind of organically happened that the high school students were hanging out with each other and said, hey, we'd like to hang out as a Buddhist group. And they go, oh, there are groups like that. So they sat down and we did a fundraiser. And again, talking about Sangha and fellow travelers, it was great because the youth group was able to teach the idea of Dana to Ekoji. So they're like, how are we going to get money to go on a trip or whatever we want to do? And so for what happens at a lot of California temples is the youth group will have a breakfast. Pancakes or whatever, and then you'll have the breakfast before service, and it's a built-in moneymaker because obviously pancakes are pretty cheap to make, and you've got a built-in audience. And so the kids were very excited. We did a Hawaiian theme, and thank you, Eric, for all those years ago making sure we had Portuguese sausage and all of this. But what was fun was that the people were coming in, and let's say the breakfast was $8. They're giving the kids a $10 bill, and they're like, oh, you need change, and the Koji Sangha is like, no, it's Dana. And the kids are like, no, it's change. So we had a really nice discussion afterwards, this is true Dana. It's like, they're not paying for the breakfast. They're supporting you. And so I smile, because the greatest fundraiser that we had 10 years ago was the junior YBA, or the high school kids. They generate a lot of income and learn that idea of Dana. And so then we sat down and they said, well, I said, what would you like to do? And they said, we'd like to meet other Buddhist youth. And so I kind of scratched my head and I said, well, for BCA, you're it. Because at Seabrook and New York, they didn't have a youth group. But we decided to go support Seabrook during their Obondori festival in August. And so we did the fundraising and we made the plans. And it was quite an interesting undertaking, because The kids, actually, Nick and Antu and True are still very active in the temple. And so we get in the van and they're laughing and singing, and we're going up to Seabrook, which is about a 3.5, 4 hour drive. And we get there the night before, and they have all this energy. And so it was hot. It was hot and humid on the East Coast, as you know, in the summertime. So it's August and it's dripping, and the young ladies got to stay in the parsonage while myself and the guys got to sleep in the basement of the temple on the floor. So that was a bonding experience. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that I was very proud of bringing this group of young people, and they were so excited to meet another Sangha. And they were wanting to help with not only helping by doing physical labor, but they wanted to learn some of the ways of doing some of the cooking or helping with the outside. So we had all these great expectations, and we get up at 6 o'clock and go into the kitchen, and it's total chaos. And so I'm looking around, and usually we've got, at least a couple, 3 people that are always the pillars of these types of events, right? And and every temple has them. And so we're looking around, and we would go up and we'd say, "Oh, can we help with setting up the bento?" "Oh, I don't know." "Well, hey kids, why don't you sit down for a while? We'll find something for you to do." And so myself and Lauren, who was the other adult advisor to this group, were kind of picking up this large amount of anxiety that was going on in the kitchen at Seabrook at 6 a.m. in the morning. And so the kids were like, trying to help. And so then we would try to start doing something. So they asked us to put the gohan or the rice into the bento box. Well, I guess, so the ladle, and you have to have a certain amount. We know how this all goes, right? And our kids weren't doing it exactly right. And one of the people that was supervising kind of freaked out and said, "You're doing it wrong. We have to be careful. We only have so much gohan," and like this. And you could just see the look on all of my YBA kids' faces, is like they were like, "Oh my gosh." And so it's like, okay. And so then they stopped doing that. And so we started doing something else. And finally, Lauren and I, because there was so much anxiety in the kitchen and the kids were picking up on it, that we decided. I said, "Lauren, why don't you take the kids to the ocean? Because Atlantic City is about an hour away, and we'll continue working here." And so she set off with the kids, and they left and came back for the Odori. But I kept working in the kitchen, and the situation was very tense. And so I got very defensive. Now, this is where the human nature comes in. Okay, so here I am, Reverend Rai. I brought my kids, I brought my Buddhist youth, and I didn't say anything, but I'm thinking, "Oh, you were kind of rude to them and made them uptight." Like, "Oh, I wanted them to be introduced to another Sangha, and it didn't come across very well." So all of these thoughts were going in my head, right? And so we have the Odori in the afternoon, and I would highly recommend all of us that are on the East Coast, if you can go to the Seabrook Obon once, I would highly recommend it, because it is the only Obon Dori that has all 3 of our taiko groups performing. And also they have a field. This is funny because Erica, people have been there know. So it's the only temple I've been to because they have a major field, and people bring their trucks up and they put the tailgates out. It's like they're watching a football game. And so here you have the dance field, and you've got all these truck downs with people sitting in their lawn chairs watching the dancing and the lanterns. It's really, really nice. So the kids came back and we danced in the Odori. The festival part went very well, and the kids had a great time. And the next morning we left for Philadelphia, and I won't go into great detail, but the kids thought they should order a Philadelphia sandwich for breakfast, and that turned out to be a disaster. I don't know what they were thinking. They're like, "This is a Philadelphia steak sandwich?" Yeah, I don't know why you ordered it for breakfast. So they were disappointed in that. And one other really fun memory I have that all of you that are older will appreciate is that we stopped at a drive-in movie theater, and they were blown away by the concept of a drive-in movie theater where they could lay back and open up the van and listen to the bad sound and all of that. But so we came back, and this idea of, our mind creates these situations. So we come back, and the kids had had a very good time, but I couldn't get it out of my head of how that early morning. And I think when we talk about how our mind creates the world, a lot of times it's easy for us to focus on the difficulties. I didn't focus on the beautiful dancing that we did in the afternoon. I didn't focus on these other activities. And the kids had a good time. I don't think they really realized the tension that was going on at the kitchen at that time. And so, again, not only does our mind tend to go towards the things that don't go so well, it's also very easy for us to connect it emotionally. So, I'm sitting there, a few days afterwards and I'm decompressing and I'm like, it was a great trip. We should have bought more pizza for the boys. The boys were hungry, etc. But then I started focusing on why was that situation so bad? Why did it have to go that way? And so I think for us in our human state, the Buddha was very aware of this, that our normal state is that we go the simplest way, the most easy way, and a lot of times it's towards the negativity. And a lot of times then it gets attached to emotion. And the emotion keeps that cycle going. And so when we talk about things as mindful practice, is to try to break us out of that cycle. So that happened. And so the following Sunday, I was to go back to Seabrook because I had to do a service. So the Bone Dory was separate, and then I had to go back for a service. And I went back, and it was such an eye-opener for me. So I go back, and the then president of the temple came up to me and said, "Oh, it was so wonderful to have your youth from Ekoji. It brought so much energy to what's going on. Everybody was talking about how friendly they were and how hard they worked and this." And then she started confiding in me that, well, one of the main people that was in charge of the kitchen for decades had passed away that year, and it was chaos for them. And actually, this is an historical fact, is at that time they thought that they might not even do the festival or not have food because it was so, they didn't know what they were doing. And so here I am as the Buddhist minister bringing up these Buddhist kids, and then I'm focusing on the negative part of that. I'm focusing on why they didn't treat our youth that way. And then I started going down that road emotionally, like, oh, why did they do this? And it was a real eye opener for me. The idea that, how we can easily go into that space. And this is a clear-cut example of one specific situation. And I never get political in my Dharma talks, but we do know that what's going on in the country right now, no matter what political party you're affiliated with or that you're not affiliated with, I think what our country is going through right now is shocking and scary. And so for me, this very simple Buddhist teaching is the world is how we create it, how we tend to go to the easiest way to follow. So for example, like a lot of us, I spend time, surfing. And so what I've done recently is I've just stopped watching a lot of the political debates or people talking about one candidate or another. And I'm not being blissfully ignorant about it. I do keep tabs of it, but I realized that my mind was like, oh, what did this person say this time? Oh, did the person really say that? And it's turned into this emotional soap opera, so to speak. And so with the teachings, when we talk about mindful practice and we talk about redirecting our focus and our attention, as I said in other talks, the Buddha is not only talking about when we talk about mindful practice to be present in the moment, but it's also how we perceive things. Is like, what are we channeling? So the idea of like, oh, am I watching this politician's news footage because I want to see the silly things or the awful things they said? No, I don't need to stimulate myself that way. The Buddha would say, being mindful in the moment. Yes, I do still read the paper every morning and skim so I know what's happening in the world, but not going down that rabbit hole of getting stuck in the idea of like, oh, this person is so bad, this person is so silly, this person is doing this, or what's going on in the world. And of course, without the politics, what's going on in the Middle East is horrifying as well. And being here in New York City, one of the things that I think that people might not be aware, I wasn't aware of it. There are more people that are Jewish in New York City metropolitan area than there are in Israel. So no matter what side you're on in that confrontation, I'm seeing demonstrations on the streets. I'm seeing a lot of anger. I'm seeing posters everywhere. And again, to acknowledge that the seriousness of what's going on, but trying not to make it into an idea where I instantly see something and then I focus on it and get angry. We've talked about that here in New York. After service, we have a lot of people that will go to informal potluck every week. And there's a lot of very good discussions, and people will talk about, I don't need to talk about specifically what's going on, but I need to talk about how I am one of the people that was very articulate said, I'm kind of addicted to this social media about following, what's going on in the Middle East or what's going on with our future presidential election, what's going on with the trial. So the Buddha again would say that, not only to be mindful of where we are in the present moment, but also to see where we put our attention is important. And the idea is that when we are starting to go down that path, which is the easiest, where we get frustrated, or if we're unconsciously looking for conflict, is to gently remind ourselves to let that go, and to pull back and to think about what would, the Buddha talk about with the pure mind. So a lot of times people will say to me, well, all these different schools of Buddhism have these various practices, and why are some schools' practices more rigorous than others? So you can look at like the Tibetan school where they do prostrations, then they do mandalas, they do all kinds of different rituals, the Zen tradition where they do zazen. And then we have our school of Buddhism, which does not have as strict practices. And so for us, being everyday Buddhist, householder Buddhist, which is the beauty of Jodo Shinshu, is that we aren't in monasteries, and we are dealing with life, but it's so easy for us to get overwhelmed with that. So for those people that have an obutsudan or an altar, I think, the easy way is that it's a great focal point to start and to end the day. I taught, believe it or not, there's a Metta Award. There's a Buddhist award for Cub Scouts. And I challenge any of you to teach a room of 10-year-old boys about Buddhism. But they had a chapter on the obutsudan, and I was pleasantly surprised because they said, oh, my grandma goes in front of the obutsudan every day and she chants and she does all these things. I don't have time for that. And what I told the kids, and I do this too, is I go to the obutsudan and you open it up and you concentrate for those few moments and you say good morning to the Buddha. And the idea, if you follow the tradition, is that, and you'll laugh now with our modern situation, your obutsudan is supposed to be bigger than your television. How many of you have a television that's this is pre-flat screen TVs, okay? But they used to always say, the ministers would say in the 1960s, your television shouldn't be bigger than your obutsudan. But getting back to the kids, then I say what to do is that, you say goodnight to Amita. And that partful is to be mindful. You don't have to chant, you don't have to do a food offering. What it is that you're taking that 30 seconds, that 1 minute to do your gasho and to close the doors. And not everybody has an obutsudan, but I know a lot of people I've spoken to, they have a statue, or they have another form that represents the Dharma for them. So in these challenging times, especially in the evening, when we've got all this stuff in our head, going in front of the obutsudan or whatever your sacred space is, and taking that moment to concentrate on what is bigger than ourselves, what's bigger than the politics that are going on. Not that it's not important, but what it is that we need to be grounded. Us going off on these tangents is not helping anyone, especially ourselves. So again, this idea of focusing, trying to redirect your focus, and limiting all of this negativity that can come out of our everyday world. So as I said, we are identified as householder Buddhists. And so when those monks and nuns are in the monastery, they don't have to deal with a lot of these things. In some ways, even though they do these rigorous practices, I think our practice of living an everyday life can be more difficult. So would you please join me in Gasha while I reread this part from the Dhammapada? And again, it's a very key component of the Buddhist teachings. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with an impure mind, and trouble will follow you, as the wheel follows the ox that draws the cart. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with a pure mind, and happiness will follow you as your shadow, unshakable. Look how he abused me, how he beat me, how he threw me down and robbed me. Live with such thoughts, and you live in hate. Look how he abused me and how he beat me, how he threw me down and robbed me. Abandon such thoughts and live in love. In this world, hate never yet dispelled hate. Only love dispels hate. This is the law, ancient and inexhaustible. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. So if everybody could please join me in the group reading tonight. So in the red book or in the PDF, we are going to be reading the Creed number 1, which is on page number 4. So if you could please join me. We rely upon Amida Tathagata with our whole heart for the enlightenment and the life to come, abstaining from all sundry practices and teachings, and giving up the trust in our limited self. We believe that the assurance of birth comes at the very moment we entrust, and we call the name Namo Amida Butsu in joy and gratitude for the Buddha's compassion. We also acknowledge gratefully the benign benevolence of our founder and the succeeding masters who have led us to believe in this profound teaching, and we do now endeavor to follow throughout our lives the way laid down for us. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. So if you could please join me in a very short sitting meditation, and then we'll open it up for the discussion group. So please relax in the chair, relax your shoulders. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.